Hello, learners, and welcome back to the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised at the end of the last lecture, we will begin to transition away from The Picture of Dorian Gray, a very powerful, complex novel, and begin our discussion of Bram Stoker's equally complex but very different kind of novel, Dracula, in this lecture. I was talking a little bit about Walter Pater's review and how that review reveals so much about both the novel as well as the culture in which the novel was conceived, composed, and produced. Walter Pater rightly noticed that the inspiration for many of the ideas articulated by the characters in the novel as well as the narrator came from his scholarly writings and lectures on the Renaissance. The Hellenism that Walter Pater advocated, some aspects of that Hellenism were very problematic, very controversial to Victorian authorities because these ideas seem to encourage intimacy between men, sexuality of a nature which was considered criminal, immoral, unnatural, and generally unacceptable in Victorian England. These aspects of Hellenism, Walter Pater was careful to redact and not articulate publicly, as we saw in the case of the 1877 edition, the second edition of his Studies in the History of the Renaissance. The second edition deleted the conclusion entirely because there was a threat that some sections of this chapter might be interpreted as immoral or even criminal. Oscar Wilde had a slightly different approach towards dealing with these public judgments of morality and liked to flirt with danger, as it were. And even though Oscar Wilde was frequently accused of writing immoral or corruptible kinds of things, Oscar Wilde never admitted that what he was writing had an immoral dimension. In fact, he very openly defended himself by saying that morality was secondary to aesthetics. This difference between accepting that morality is important and aesthetics is less important defines the difference between Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater. While Walter Pater openly advocated a kind of aesthetics which, if taken to its logical conclusion, would end up justifying homosexuality, Walter Pater was very careful to denounce such sexuality in public, to declare that it was immoral. Oscar Wilde, however, did not declare any kind of sexuality as immoral. In fact, always argued that morality itself was subordinate to aesthetics. In his review of Oscar Wilde's novel, Walter Pater again upholds this very public position about the immorality of certain kinds of human sexuality and behavior. So for Pater, Dorian Gray's story is a very plain moral story. And this is different from Walter Pater's assertion in the preface that there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. The differences between the magazine version and the book version would come back to haunt Oscar Wilde much later, in the year 1895, when there was a public trial in which Oscar Wilde was accused of acts of gross indecency, that is, of having unnatural sexual relations with another man. And during the court case, during the public trial in 1895, the lawyer for the prosecution, that is Edward Carson, made it a point to read from and quote the magazine version of The Picture of Dorian Gray. Remember, this was the version that was taken out of print. This was the version that Oscar Wilde himself had revised, and the nature of those revisions were intended to tone down some of the intimacy or the sexuality or the friendship between these two young men. Nonetheless, the lawyer for the prosecution, Edward Carson, who wanted to make a case that Oscar Wilde should be punished for unnatural sexuality and gross indecency, quoted from the redacted version, quoted from the 1890 magazine version, and even quoted sentences which Oscar Wilde himself had deleted and removed from the 1891 book version. In this deleted sentence, but not deleted or still available to the court and the lawyer, Basil Hallward declares to Dorian, "Your friendship is dearer to me than any fame or reputation." In the 1890 text, the painter confesses, that is, Basil Hallward the painter confesses to Dorian, "It is quite true that I have worshipped you with far more romance of feeling than a man usually gives to a friend. Perhaps, as Harry says, a really grand passion is the privilege of those who have nothing to do, and that is the use of the idle classes in a country. I quite admit that I adored you madly, extravagantly, and absurdly." You can see in these sentences, in these words, there is a kind of honesty which is almost too painful to bear. The honesty that Basil Hallward declares within the safe and confidential space, within a private space that is open to two men, and of course, which was also available to these two men because of the privileged position they occupied in late Victorian England. However, this confession, this very private and personal confession, is turned into a public statement when the lawyer quotes from this fictional declaration of grand passion and accuses the author of these lines, Oscar Wilde, of gross indecency. So we can see that the magazine world, the popular periodical press, which inaugurated the career of many writers, also came back to haunt Oscar Wilde. And as a result of this quotation, of course, not only due to this quotation, but this quotation played a very big role in the trial. As a result of this quotation, the lawyer was able to argue that Oscar Wilde should be punished for gross indecency. The state and the judge agreed, and Oscar Wilde was subjected to 2 years of hard labor and imprisonment. This ultimately took a toll on Oscar Wilde's life and career, and he died shortly afterwards. Now, as we transition from this novel to another one published in the last decade of the 19th century, it's important to note the difference between the public and the private realms. And it's also important to note that the trial that Oscar Wilde faced and the consequence of the trial, the punishment which was declared, that the imprisonment to which Oscar Wilde was sentenced, all of these things had wide repercussions. They changed the views of other writers all over England who might have feared similar repercussions for themselves. One such writer who feared similar repercussions for himself was Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker, as you all know, is the author of the novel Dracula. Dracula first appeared in print about 7 years after the picture of Dorian Gray. That is, Dracula appeared in print on 26 May 1897, priced 6 shillings and with a print run of 3,000 copies. 4 years later, the novel was reissued with illustrations, and these illustrations were the only ones that Bram Stoker had been able to approve in his lifetime. In these illustrations, we see the eponymous character, that is Count Dracula. He looks in a very peculiar way. He's dressed in the clothes and carries the temperament and the visage and the countenance of a military commander. He has thick white hair, a bushy mustache, also very thick and white, and is dressed in a bat-like cloak, standing on the balcony or terrace of a castle. This is, of course, Castle Dracula, and he is surveying a great open expanse before him. This image is very different from the image of Dracula which has survived and with which we have come to view Dracula. This other image, which is seen in countless popular visual representations of Dracula, is very different from that of a strong, broad-shouldered military commander. In fact, this image is that of a lounge lizard. This image is of a character or a person who is very slimy and who is very creepy and who manages to walk silently and slip in and out of rooms because of the slightness of his shape and weight of his body. Countless film representations, and there are more than 300 of these, and it's worth pausing and to note actually the range and the kind of visual representations that have been produced of Dracula. It is important to note that in the Western Anglophone world, Bram Stoker's Victorian novel Dracula might have been the first popular iteration of this blood-sucking vampire, but by no means was this the first or even pioneering. In many contexts, both Eastern and Western, stories of these blood-sucking vampiric creatures have been circulated, have been composed, told, and distributed and enjoyed by many generations of readers. So the newness that most film representations that Hollywood seems to associate with Stoker's novel is a bit misplaced. Nonetheless, this misplaced newness has still managed to produce a flood of representations, and they continue to be active. In fact, every year one is sure to note at least 2 to 3 film and TV adaptations of this story. There is a mismatch between the flood of these visual representations of Dracula and the literary career of Bram Stoker. The first thing to note is that Dracula became much bigger than Bram Stoker's other literary output during Bram Stoker's lifetime. So Bram Stoker wrote a lot of other work, reviews, essays, fiction, non-fiction, but none of those works became as famous as this book. And after Bram Stoker's death, that is in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century, Dracula became even bigger than Stoker himself. This can be noted in the fact that when Stoker died in the year 1912, many newspapers carried obituaries. So Stoker was well known as a writer, which is why there were so many obituaries at his death. It was felt that a very solid contributor to the literary culture of Victorian England had passed. But none of these obituaries, not a single one of these obituaries, mentioned Dracula. So this is something to note, that a work that is so famous was not mentioned in an obituary of the author when he passed away in 1912. So for Victorian readers, Dracula was not as important as it is today. In fact, more than important, it is popular. Dracula today is practically a household name. Every child, whether or not they are studying Victorian literature, knows about Dracula. Dracula is popular through popular culture, through films, through comic books, through superheroes, through characters like Van Helsing, through stories like the Twilight Saga by Stephanie Meyer, by the Vampire Diaries, through films like the Vikram Vedha series, which in fact is an adaptation of the Vikram Vedha stories. There are countless. One can go on and on. In fact, the adaptations of the Dracula story, if one includes vampire stories from other cultures, will take up several modules, several books to study properly. Nonetheless, compare this widespread popularity of Dracula with relative obscurity of Bram Stoker's name and life and career. Bram Stoker today is a name that's recognized only by those studying Victorian literature or English literature, or those who are preparing for some sort of competition or knowledge-based quizzes. This is a very interesting fact for us to note. We will not be focusing on these popular adaptations today, and we will be focusing instead more on that obscurity to which Bram Stoker has been relegated. We will be studying Victorian literature by understanding how these early reviewers reacted to Stoker's novel. The original reviews did not find anything admirable. They criticized many things, and for them Dracula was an interesting book, but nothing about the book signaled immortality or fame. It was not a book that contemporary reviewers felt would stand up to the test of time. Of course, the very opposite of that happened. but this is what the reviewers felt. They compared it to other popular and Gothic stories, and they found this particular iteration of the Gothic story to be a bit overdone. They felt that the narrator and the writer were trying too hard. The violence and the gore was very much on the nose, and this was seen as a lower form, a less sophisticated, less interesting form of the Gothic. There was one form of the Gothic which was suggestive, and there was another form of the Gothic which was all about graphic violence and blood and thunder and ghosts. And not so much ghosts, but even demons and monsters. And this is the kind of violence and bloodshed we see in Dracula. There is a demon and who goes around killing people and sucking their blood, literally. So, for a lot of reviewers, the kind of violence and thrills that are generated in Dracula representative of the lower form of the Gothic. These reviewers found Dracula disturbing, but not as disturbing as, say, the plays of Henrik Ibsen or the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. There was something that the Victorian reviewers could not quite identify. The novel had something very transgressive, something very subversive. It was mildly offending because it described things that were considered a little bit not okay, a little bit immoral, but that immorality was nowhere near the kind of immorality one could see in, say, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In the place of finding what was disturbing, or in the absence of this clearly identifiable disturbing element in Dracula, Victorian reviewers and writers focused on the use of technology in the novel. That is, they understood how the novel described blood transfusions, phonograph recordings, shorthand typing, etc. All of these were new technologies. And how these technologies helped tell a story of war between good and evil, a morality tale in which the forces of good were represented by science and religion, and evil by the Count and his ilk. In the original manuscripts, the Count Dracula, the main protagonist or the main villain of the story, was named Count Vampire, and he had features that resembled Dorian Gray in Oscar Wilde's novel, the novel we have just finished studying. In Stoker's original draft, the Count had these features. He had a feature of creating evil thoughts in others. So he was a potentially corruptible and corrupting influence. He could create corruption in others. He could travel long distances in the dark. He could travel even when it was dark and visibility was low due to fog. So resembles Dorian's nighttime visits to East London. This character was insensitive and insensible to food or drink. So he was seemingly able to sustain himself with very little or no food, which is also similar to Dorian Gray because there are no descriptions of Dorian eating or drinking. There's also a strange relationship to visual devices and modes of capturing his appearance in visual form. That is, in Stoker's drafts, Count Dracula cannot be painted or photographed. Whenever that is done, the portrait ends up misrepresenting Dracula or representing someone else. Portraits end up describing other people, and photos of Count Dracula always come out black or show skeletons. Further, this Count Dracula does not have mirrors or looking glasses in his house. It seems he cannot bear to see his own reflection, or perhaps does not want to, and he also does not have a shadow. So there are some similarities, and they have to do with the complex relationship to visual media. And in these cases, Bram Stoker's Dracula resembles Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray. But in the final manuscript version, these differences were removed. These and any other reference to aesthetic, sensual, or sexual aspects of the vampire's personality were removed. Bram Stoker, one can see, was directly impacted by Oscar Wilde's trial and very carefully wished to avoid the kind of punishment or the kind of consequences Oscar Wilde had suffered due to the way his novel was received and the way he continued, that is, Oscar Wilde, continued to defend and argue for his novel. Bram Stoker took a very different stance. Instead of downplaying this kind of immorality, he very clearly emphasized a clear moral distinction between good and bad. So while Oscar Wilde deflected the question of whether sexuality was immoral, Bram Stoker very clearly emphasized that sexuality was immoral. Bram Stoker wrote letters to very senior government officials in which he explained that the terrors and the violence described in the novel, while it may signal some unease due to its connection to sexuality, ultimately it was of a harmless kind. The relationship to sexuality of the violence described in Dracula was described as harmless. This is what Bram Stoker tried to convince a lot of people through his letters. Now, the very fact that Stoker wrote these letters, the very fact that Stoker argued for this particular logic of viewing, reading, and interpreting violence means that Stoker was anxious to produce a certain kind of effect. Stoker wanted readers to read his novel in a certain way, which means that there was something that he wished to hide. That if the relationship to sexuality is presented as harmless, then this effort exists or this desire exists precisely because there is a truth which is more complex. Now, there is a tension between the external claim or appearance and the true source of the energy of the narrative of Dracula. Now, the appearance of it is that Bram Stoker himself and the characters in the novel are all respectable pillars of Victorian morality. The violence in Dracula is aimed at a particular establishment of morality. The Count articulates a very subversive desire, and ultimately the Count is killed and vanished, and these subversive desires, these illegal and immoral sexualities, are all suppressed, banished, and repressed. But the novel asks us to think about the nature of repression. When something is declared immoral and condemned, where does it go? What is the consequence of that condemnation? Do those desires disappear, or do those desires take a secret, hidden form as a monstrosity? Now, that is an open question, and Dracula deals with the nature of monstrosity. Dracula codes monstrosity as a kind of repressed desire. Now, in order to understand more about what is this relationship between repression, desire, and the appearance of respectability, one needs to understand the origin of Dracula in a dream that Bram Stoker apparently had in March 1890, that is almost 7 years before the novel was actually published. In this dream, and this is something Bram Stoker describes in his journals and manuscripts, Stoker describes a young man walking the streets of London who is seen by some young girls. One of these girls tries to kiss him, but she tries to kiss him not on the face or on the lips, but his neck. Now, as she's about to do it, from somewhere a Count emerges, a visibly older but stylish, dandyish looking man, and he displays a great deal of diabolical rage. So this older, stylish Count is enraged because a woman is about to kiss a man. And he displays this rage by saying, "This man belongs to me, I want him." This is the dream which Bram Stoker calls a bad dream, and he writes about in his journal. And it seems to have laid the foundation, seems to have sowed the seed for the novel that eventually becomes Dracula. The same year, in the summer, in August, Bram Stoker took a vacation with his family and came across the name Dracula. He was vacationing in the town of Whitby in Yorkshire, and at a museum, he came across this book, a very dull book by a retired British diplomat who had traveled to Eastern Europe, traveled eastward from England, that is. And if you remember the lecture on Dorian Gray, Dorian moves eastward from Piccadilly and very old neighborhoods in London. The move eastward within London is a move from privilege and conventional morality towards poverty, crime, and illegal sexuality. Compared to that, the movement in Dracula is even more eastward. The protagonist, Jonathan Harker, is traveling by train to Romania, while Dorian Gray goes only as far as the East End in London. Jonathan Harker is going further, much, much further east from England. He's going to a different country, Romania, where he will encounter this evil count who is actually a blood-sucking vampire. So this is one way in which Dorian Gray and Dracula are connected. The authors of these novels describe movement eastwards, describe movements from respectable privilege, conventional morality, towards a sort of exotic, different, and illegal and dangerous place. During his vacation in Whitby, Yorkshire, Stoker came across the name Dracula in a book by a diplomat who had traveled eastward. This diplomat had traveled to Wallachia and Moldavia and had written a book in which the word Dracula appeared. This inspired Bram Stoker to compose a manuscript, which he did over the next 6 years, traveling all over the British Isles. So Dracula was composed all over the British Isles, that is in London, Scotland, and Ireland. Stoker changed the title at the very last minute, just before submitting the manuscript, from The Undead, which was the original title, the working title, to Dracula. Now, it's worth noting a little bit about Bram Stoker's origins and biographical background. Stoker was born to a very ordinary middle-class family and did not have any very obvious or strong literary or cultural ambitions in the beginning. Stoker studied science at Trinity College Dublin and performed very well, was a star athlete as well as a star debater, and performed very well in academics as well. He ended up getting a very respectable government job following the lines of his father. So both Stoker Sr. and Bram Stoker worked as clerks in the Dublin castle. He managed paperwork, collected taxes, filled a lot of bureaucratic duties, and just pushed a lot of paper. At some point, however, he moved from Dublin Castle to London to take up the position of the business manager, front of house master of ceremonies, and box office administrator at the Lyceum Theatre in London. It was at this location, at the Lyceum Theatre in London, that Bram Stoker was exposed to a great deal of literary and cultural influences. And this might have been the stage in his career where Stoker began to harbor serious literary ambitions. He had published a lot of reviews and nonfiction earlier, but it was at this stage that he began to compose long-form fiction as well as short and long-form fiction, that is novels and short stories. He worked as the manager and the right-hand man to Henry Irving, who was a very famous actor and also part owner of the Lyceum Theatre. At this theatre, a lot of writers, actors, as well as playwrights frequented, and Bram Stoker was frequently tasked with organizing private parties in a secret room that was designed as a beefsteak corner with food and drink for special guests of Irving. It was during these gatherings, these very private parties with literary celebrities, that Bram Stoker rubbed shoulders with the who's who of Victorian literary scene. We know this because Bram Stoker made notes. He described the names as well as the gatherings and everyone he met at these gatherings in a notebook that he maintained. For some reason, even though he made a very elaborate list of people who met and whom he had to entertain, in this list, he seems to have left out the name of Oscar Wilde. This is a very strange and not very strange omission because on one hand, it is well known that Oscar Wilde frequented the Lyceum Theatre and was very good friends with many people who worked there. So it is simply not possible that Bram Stoker had not met Oscar Wilde. But the name Oscar Wilde is missing from the notebook and the lists that Bram Stoker kept. In order to understand this, we need to understand a little bit about the need to maintain the appearance of respectability, even while the reality was less respectable. So, Bram Stoker had known of Oscar Wilde not only because of Oscar Wilde's literary work, but also because Bram Stoker's own interest in literature and especially theatre. During his time in Dublin, while working as a castle officer, Stoker had written many public and private letters. He had reviewed a lot of work by Oscar Wilde. He had also reviewed a lot of work by Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, as many of you will know, was a pioneering American poet who had written this very long and epic book, Leaves of Grass, was also a pioneer of many sorts because he was also very well known for being a homosexual. And while this was not published, many who had working knowledge of these matters knew the reality of Walt Whitman. Bram Stoker was also very inspired by Walt Whitman and wrote very glowing public reviews of Whitman's literary work. Many of these reviews were published as reviews and essays. But he also wrote a lot of writings, a lot of letters and essays and confessional documents addressed to Walt Whitman. A lot of these documents were not published. Uh, in fact, many of his letters addressed to Whitman he did not even send. That is, Bram Stoker was too cautious and did not feel that he had the courage to send his own confessions, his own thoughts to Walt Whitman, even though it would be a private letter and would be protected from affecting his reputation in any way. So these writings, which Stoker did not send to even Whitman, fearing some sort of damage to his reputation, declared a somewhat hesitant attachment, but a very strong attachment, both to Whitman and to what Whitman represented. That is, an approach to morality and sexuality which did not align with the reigning public and accepted religious morality of the time. We will discuss more about the kind of repression Bram Stoker might have undertaken and how this sort of repression constitutively and very richly shapes the novel Dracula. We will also refer to the work of scholars in the tradition of queer studies, chiefly the work of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Talia Schaefer. We will discuss these things in subsequent lectures. Thank you.